President Donald Trump's suggestion to invoke the Insurrection Act marked one of the most controversial moments of his presidency, reflecting both his hardline stance on law and order and his willingness to test the limits of executive authority during periods of domestic unrest. The proposal emerged in mid-2020 amid nationwide protests following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which sparked widespread demonstrations against police brutality and racial injustice across major American cities. As protests continued in places such as Portland, Oregon, and Chicago, Illinois, Trump frequently criticized local and state officials, accusing them of being weak and failing to protect their citizens from what he described as chaos, vandalism, and violent crime. In this tense political environment, Trump publicly floated the idea of using the Insurrection Act, a centuries-old federal law, as a tool to send active-duty military forces into American cities to quell disturbances, even if state governors did not request or approve such assistance. The suggestion immediately drew both support and criticism. Supporters of Trump's stance argued that restoring order and protecting property were paramount responsibilities of the federal government, especially when state and local authorities appeared unable or unwilling to do so. They saw his willingness to deploy troops as a strong response to what they perceived as lawlessness and domestic terrorism carried out by extremist elements exploiting legitimate protests. On the other hand, critics viewed the move as a dangerous overreach of presidential power, warning that it could set a precedent for using the military to suppress dissent and peaceful demonstrations. Legal scholars, civil rights groups, and many political leaders cautioned that invoking the Insurrection Act in this context could escalate tensions, violate civil liberties, and undermine democratic norms by blurring the line between civilian law enforcement and military authority. Historically, the Insurrection Act had been invoked only in exceptional circumstances, such as during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when Presidents Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy deployed federal troops to enforce desegregation orders and protect African American students in the South. Those interventions were aimed at upholding constitutional rights rather than suppressing protest, and many legal experts noted that Trump's potential use of the act in 2020 would have represented a far broader and more politically charged application. The law itself, first passed in 1792 and last amended in 1871, gives the president authority to deploy the military domestically to suppress insurrection, rebellion, or obstruction of federal law, even without the consent of state governments. However, its language is deliberately narrow, reflecting the founders' deep concern about maintaining civilian control over the military and preventing its use as a political end. The Insurrection Act is one of the oldest and most controversial pieces of legislation in the history of the United States, carrying with it both the legacy of early American struggles for national stability and the tension between federal power and individual state authority. Passed originally in 1792 during George Washington's presidency, the law was designed as a means for the federal government to respond swiftly to uprisings, rebellions, or large-scale civil disturbances that threatened the functioning of the republic. Its roots lie in the early years of the nation when the new federal government faced challenges in asserting authority over the states, particularly during events like the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. The framers of the law sought to give the president limited but decisive powers to deploy the military in moments of crisis while maintaining a balance that would prevent the misuse of force against the population. Over time, the act was modified and expanded, most notably in 1807 and later in 1871 during the Reconstruction era, reflecting changing national concerns about internal security and civil rights. The 1871 update, often referred to as the Ku Klux Klan Act, allowed the president to use military force to protect the civil rights of freed African Americans in the South, where violent white supremacist groups were undermining federal laws and terrorizing communities. This demonstrated how the Insurrection Act could serve not only as a tool for suppressing rebellion but also as a mechanism for enforcing justice and equality under the Constitution. However, its dual nature, granting both protective and coercive power, has made it a source of enduring controversy. The act permits the president to deploy the armed forces domestically under three broad circumstances: to suppress insurrection against the United States, to enforce federal law when ordinary judicial proceedings are obstructed, or to protect civil rights when states fail to do so. Importantly, the law allows federal intervention even without the consent of state governors if the president determines that the situation warrants it. While this authority can be crucial in moments of genuine crisis, it also raises the risk of abuse by allowing a president to act unilaterally and potentially override the sovereignty of individual states. Historically, presidents have invoked the Insurrection Act sparingly and typically only when local or state governments requested federal assistance. For example, President Eisenhower used it in 1957 to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, after the state's governor defied a federal court order. Similarly, President John F. Kennedy relied on the act to ensure that African American students could safely enroll at the University of Mississippi in 1962 and the University of Alabama in 1963. These instances demonstrated the Act's role in upholding federal law and protecting civil rights when state authorities refused to do so.